Welcome to Alter Show. Last week, we began talking about augmented and virtual reality, and specifically, we started talking about the hardware. We talked about augmented reality, virtual reality, we even mentioned mixed reality, and we left off before we started actually diving into the use cases. So that's what we're going to do this week. And just to sort of recap, or as a slight overview, the use cases are why AR and VR matter, but the hardware is what enables it, so that's why it makes sense to start with the hardware. But now that we've covered that topic, it's time to move on to the use cases. So there are a sort of large number of use cases for augmented and virtual reality. The way that I think about it, at least, is that many of them are related to one another. So, for example, up here we have storytelling, which is related to gaming, which is related to social VR or AR, which is related to these four different types of productivity tools or applications, so education and training, collaboration, engineering and architecture and art. And then we have this thing that we refer to as cognitive extension, which is something that Alter does, but we will actually wait till the next video to discuss that. To start off, we are going to talk about storytelling with AR and VR. Now, in the sort of classical digital method of storytelling, there is someone sitting in front of a screen and they're looking through the screen, and that is the method in which they receive their content, right? So their stimulation probably comes in through the ear and some number of degrees for their eyes. But with immersive technology like AR and VR, we end up with new possibilities. We end up with 360 degrees, meaning that there is a person who is observing this immersive content, and they may see a house to their back right, they may see a car over there to their front right, they may see more people over towards their left, and this is just kind of a contrived, trivial example, but it starts to become meaningful when you think about, for example, dropping someone in the middle of the Colosseum during a gladiator fight. And the reason that this is sort of the case is because immersive technology, specifically VR really, has rotation, and that I can turn around and there's stuff all around me. But if this were all I were seeing right now, if there was actually the real world back here, if I turned my head, I would no longer be seeing what's on the screen. And this is a big step up from screen-based technology. And when you go to VR as opposed to just 360 degrees, VR actually makes things look three-dimensional as opposed to just in all directions. And that has the highest level of immersion. Again, that is because VR has depth, whereas what would be referred to as 360-degree photography or videography does not. And this depth enables interactivity. And this is actually where we're going to step into the next bubble here when we talk about gaming, because once you have interactivity, you can start to combine this notion of storytelling or narrative with a game. And so we dive into gaming. Gaming in VR was probably one of the first use cases, aside from simulators that were used in flight training. It's also relevant for AR, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, I'm going to talk about a few different VR games that have been made, because they're each kind of relevant in different ways. One of the most popular ones is this game called Job Simulator. It's built by Alchemy Labs, which recently joined Google. And Job Simulator simulates doing mundane jobs like copying documents or putting disks into computers, but simulates it as though it were in 2050. And the kind of interesting part about this is it infuses everyday activities with joy. Things float, things make cool sounds, they respond when you throw them. And that is one of the sort of points it's one of the most incredible things about VR, is the ability to infuse everyday activities with joy. And AR actually does the same thing. So AR gaming actually really stands to benefit from this notion of taking something perhaps mundane, like maybe putting toast in the toaster or toast coming out of the toaster, and all of a sudden giving it some more engaging visual appearance, or some animation occurs. Maybe a character pops out of the toaster on top of the piece of toast and then runs around on the counter. So AR gaming also stands to benefit and leverages this infusion of joy into everyday lives. Then we have a game called Super Hot VR. Super Hot VR is extremely cool, as well as being beautiful, would highly recommend playing it if you have the chance. And Superhot VR is unique because the time step of the game, or the rate at which the time in the game goes, is dependent on how fast you're moving. So if I'm standing still, like I am right now, the game stands still. If I move very slowly, the game moves slowly. And if I move quickly, the game moves at full speed. And what this is exemplary of is the way in which VR can be used in gaming to provide totally impossible experiences. So that is this big other category of why VR gaming is unique and adds this big amount of value. It can give totally impossible experiences. Now, these are just a couple of the VR games that have been successful. There are a number of others. We may devote a future video to those games explicitly. But one interesting thing about gaming is that it starts to overlap a little bit with what's called this social VR, or multiple people in the same virtual environment. Now, when you talk about virtual reality, you talk about something called presence, which is defined as the degree to which you feel there in the room. And with social VR, you talk about social presence, so the degree to which you feel there with someone else. Now, the classic two-dimensional way for having a shared presence with someone who's located far away from you is over a computer screen, right? So there's one person here, and their presence is constrained by the screen. But when you start to be able to perceive things in 3 dimensions, you can perceive a 3-dimensional person or an avatar of a person standing right here in front of me. So I could, for example, perceive there to be an actual person right here, and they look 3-dimensional. And that is a much more powerful experience than with simply a screen. In fact, Facebook did a study using social VR, and they found that 57% of extroverts and, strangely and intriguingly, 83% of introverts were in VR, or who were in VR and chatting with a VR friend, wanted to actually become friends with the people they were talking with. All they did was communicate with this person in VR for one session. So social VR is really interesting because it actually forges meaningful relationships between people, even though they're represented as virtual characters. There are a number of social VR applications which sort of have different uses, but 3 notable ones are big screen VR, which lets people collaborate while using applications on their desktop computer screen. Altspace VR, which does a bunch of different things, including hosting live events. Then Facebook Spaces, which is well integrated with Messenger and is Facebook's first forage into the social VR territory. Social VR has both gaming elements. So there's, for example, a game and social experience called Rec Room, where people can come in and, for example, play VR paintball. But it also starts to merge into the productivity category. And there are a lot of different productivity applications in VR. I'm just going to pick one of these, and I'm going to start with collaboration here, because collaboration is most closely related to the bubble we were just in, which was social. And specifically, collaborative VR experiences just basically means it's social, but it also facilitates productivity. Why is it useful to have collaborative VR tools and collaborativity in the context of work or in education? Well, first of all, it's kind of fun. If we remember back to I believe it was gaming bubble, we talked about how VR can infuse joy into everyday activities. And that's true of games, but that's also true of really any other VR experience, including collaborative ones. And we also talked about in the social bubble, the ability to build good relationships in VR, which means that if there is, for example, a remote team, they can collaborate together in VR and forge solid relationships, which makes work just much more efficient. Or similarly, they can build better relationships with their clients, which is, of course, beneficial to the sales process. So you take sort of the social component of VR and you give it productivity tools. A good example of one is Big Screen, as we talked about before, which lets you take applications from your desktop screen and view them and interact with them collaboratively in VR. There's a company called Iris VR, which does something similar except for architectural models. And then there's Alter, that's us. We also support collaboration if you're interested in learning more. A quick plug, reach out to us at contact@altershow.com. There are a number of VR applications which work on collaboration, all have their sort of different specific strengths. It's just one of the areas of productivity that VR seems to be well suited for. Since we talked about architecture very briefly, I'll dive into this bubble as well. So one of the cool things about VR is that you can bring in 3D models that normally would be looked at on a screen, and you would actually see them in 3D. So here we've got this model of a house, and sort of to illustrate, we've got 2 human-sized stick figures, which are each in virtual reality, and they could be in the same environment, and they're looking at the shared model. So if they are working on this design, or if it's a designer or an architect and a client, they can point to individual facets of this building, this not particularly fancy building. Maybe the client says, "Hey, I want a rooftop garden," and they can sort of illustrate how it would look. That's really powerful because it gives a good way for a client to visualize what a project may turn out to be, and it gives a good way for the designer to explore different possibilities. Same thing can be done with, for example, CAD parts. So if I had a model of an engine and I was designing an airplane, there are a lot of different companies working on VR solutions for engineering and architecture. Another thing we can talk about with VR and productivity is education and training. Now, the thing with education or training is that real-world experiences in the first person are extremely valuable. Classically, if I wanted to train someone to operate a crane, they'd have to go sit in a crane and actually operate the crane. That's a big piece of machinery, and if you use it incorrectly, that's not good. Bad things could happen. But the cool part about VR is that you can provide quote-unquote real experiences that are actually virtual. The human here wearing a virtual reality headset perceives the virtual crane in front of them as real. So they actually have the opportunity to train again and again and again on the crane until they get it just right, which means when they go operate the real crane, they're less likely to make mistakes. There are a bunch of different ways to work with this concept. There's a bunch of medical or surgery training through VR simulation work that's being done. There is Striver, which is an interesting company that came out of Stanford, which has trained athletes using VR. They've also been using VR to train on interpersonal skills. Education and training is probably one of the most exciting and spaces to be in virtual reality, because virtual reality in a lot of ways introduces kind of wonder into the mix, and that tends to be something which boosts educational outcomes. Now, finally, with VR and productivity, we can talk about art. And art isn't necessarily productivity, but I felt that it sort of fell into this category. There are 2 big applications that come to mind. One made by Oculus, which is owned by Facebook, called Medium, and one called Tilt Brush, which was made by Google. Medium lets you sculpt in VR, and Tilt Brush lets you paint in VR. There's been amazing work done with both of these. Medium sort of takes an existing concept of sculpture and VRifies it. Tilt Brush does something interesting and kind of defines a new, I hate to use the word again, but medium, in that it's painting in 3D. It's similar to this 3D sketching where, okay, let's try and draw this creature. It's going to be bad. So we've got some eyes here. Okay. And a mouth with teeth. The compelling part about it is that I can walk around it and see it from different angles. And I can make a virtual immersive environment artistically, and that I could draw another creature over here, a friend of this creature. And that is kind of, with VR and art, the 3-dimensionality really, I guess, starts to shine a little bit, because it is specifically the 3-dimensionality that enables things which could not have happened before. So we've just gone through and talked about some of the use cases of virtual reality and augmented reality. We started with storytelling and worked our way all the way over to productivity. Over here we have a bubble called cognitive extension. We're going to actually dive into this in a future video, but cognitive extension is the thing that we do at Alter. And cognitive extension, as you can see illustrated by these pink relations, ends up drawing on or referring to or working with many of the different use cases of VR. And that's one of the reasons we're so excited about it. And so with that, that is it for today. Tune in next week for the next installment in this little short series about augmented and virtual reality, where we discuss Alter and cognitive extension. We'd love if you have any comments and you can post them. We'd love if you would subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to reach out at contact@altershow.com. Thank you very much.